Welcome back to Understanding Python. My name is Jake, and today we'll be building upon what we learned in the previous video. This time, instead of manually parsing and validating CLI input, we'll be using Python's built-in Argparse module. As we go, if you learned something new, let me know by liking the video. Now let's get started. In our last video, we made a pizza builder program with a command line interface, which we see on the left-hand side of the screen. In here, we did have to define a few helper functions for us to process the input, as well as validate the input. If you haven't watched that video, I highly recommend you check it out. There will be a link in the top right of the screen now. However, for today, we're not going to be manually validating input or processing input. We're going to be using Argparse. We also won't have to define custom help text like this. Instead, we're going to let Argparse do all of that work for us. We will borrow a couple of things from this pizza builder so we don't have to do that same work again. So let's keep our definitions for sizes and crusts and pop them over here on the right, which is what we'll be working in. I also want to keep the output for build pizza to be approximately the same. So we'll copy that helper function and just pop that down in there. And that should be just about all we need from the old pizza builder. So we'll just give ourselves a little bit more room and go back up to the top. In order to use Argparse, we are going to just simply import Argparse. We'll leave all of this alone for now and head down to the bottom where we'll write our usual if name is equal to main statement. And this is where we'll start to define our Argparse CLI. The first thing we're going to need is to instantiate a parser object. For this, we'll say parser is equal to argparse dot argument parser. Now we could be perfectly fine passing nothing into the argument parser class for its init. However, if we want to have a description like we did with pizza builder, where we said, welcome to the pizza builder, let's build a pizza, what we can do is simply copy that, and over here where we call argument parser, we'll set its description equal to exactly that text. This time let's be slightly more excited by putting an extra exclamation point. Now we have a parser object. Now there are a few things we can do with this parser object, but when it comes to building a CLI, we're mainly going to be focusing on parser.addArgument. The addArgument method itself can take a number of arguments when you call it. It has a combination of positional and keyword arguments. First, we're going to tell it that the name of this argument is size by simply passing in a positional argument with the string size. We can specify the data type that we're expecting from the CLI by saying type is equal to string, meaning that anything passed in should be a string or can be converted into a string. One of the great things about Argparse is all the features that are built into this addArgument method. One of these, which we're going to be taking advantage of today, is called choices. With choices, you can specify some kind of iterable, which will make sure that the user only inputs values that are in that iterable. For our iterable, we're going to use the sizes constant and specifically the keys of that sizes constant. So the choices are going to be S, M, L, XL, and XXL. If the user inputs any value that is different from that, then Argparse is going to spit out a warning and let them know that that is an invalid choice and give them a list of the valid choices. Final argument we're going to add is some custom help text. And the help text for size is size of your pizza. Awesome. So let's save that and run it and see what happens. Okay, we ran it and nothing happened. What happens if we were to specify -- help? Nothing. How come this parser isn't working? Well, there's one crucial thing that we need to do to actually make all of this work. We need to tell it to actually parse the arguments. So we'll store that as parsed args is equal to parser dot parse args. Notice that we're not passing anything in to parse args. This is because by default, parse args is going to parse sys.argv just like we did in our previous video. It will also ignore that first entry of the sys.argv argument list. So it's only going to parse the parts that are distinct from saying pizzabuilder.py. Let's save this and try it again. And we printed something out. Let's give ourselves some more room. And we see usage, pizzabuilder.py, -h, or -help. And then we see the options that are available for size, SM, L, XL, and XXL. We also see our welcome message or description, as well as the positional arguments here, which again repeats the valid sizes, as well as the help text, size of your pizza. We also see something really nice here, where we get the -h and -help behavior for free. You don't have to do anything for Argparse to include that for you. Now, you can turn that off if you want to, but for our usage, we're just going to leave it as is. Okay, so one argument down. Let's go ahead and add another. This one is going to be the crust, which is very similar to what we did for size. So we'll copy and paste that, change out size for crust. And this will be crusts.keys. And the help text for this will be type of pizza crust. Okay, we'll save that and see how it looks. Perfect. So we now have a new positional argument. The valid options are normal, thin, and deep. And we see type of pizza crust. Now in our original pizza builder, you'll see that we have something similar. We have arguments, which were size and crust, and we also had options. Now how do we add in these options to the optional arguments down here? Here's where we get into a little bit of specifics about those positional arguments we were passing into add argument. I'll write out the positional argument for extra cheese and see if you can notice the difference. Do you see it? The difference between these is that extra cheese has a dash in front of it. You could also optionally add a -c here. One or both of these are valid for adding optional arguments to your parser. So Argparse will see these without the dash as positional arguments, and these with a single or double dash as optional arguments. This is very important to keep in mind, as these first two arguments are implicitly required, meaning that if a user doesn't pass in a value for those, they're going to get a warning. However, for these, unless you make them required by default, by passing in required equals true, then a user doesn't have to pass in values for those arguments because they're optional. For us, we're going to take off the required equals true because I want people to make pizzas without having to pass in extra cheese. And if you don't say required is equal to true, it is false by default. Now again, remembering back to our previous video, extra cheese is what I called a flag, meaning if you passed in --extra cheese, we would say that that value is true. Otherwise, the value is false. We can get the same behavior for free with Argparse by specifying the action. So there are a few different actions that are available with Argparse. The one we're going to be using today is called store true, meaning that if this argument is passed in, or the -c form, it's going to store the value of true into extra cheese. So this is how we get our flag behavior. If someone runs it with -extra cheese will be set to true. Otherwise, if they don't pass it in, extra cheese will be set to false. Now, if you're a big cheese lover and you want extra cheese to be the default, you can reverse that behavior by specifying store false. So if they don't pass in -extra cheese, then it's going to say extra cheese is equal to true. If they do say extra cheese, then it's going to say extra cheese is equal to false because it's storing the value of false into extra cheese when this flag is passed in. Now extra cheese might be a bit long for a variable name to work with. The extra, we don't really need to have that on there. so we can take advantage of another feature of Argparse, which is setting dest or destination is equal to cheese, meaning that instead of storing extra cheese into a variable called extra_cheese, it will store it into a variable called cheese. And I'll show you where that variable lives in just a few minutes. But for now, let's add in some help text. Let's also do the same thing real quick for extra sauce. And we'll change that to a -s. Now, while this is a few lines, the line length is getting a little unruly, so give me a minute to make the formatting a little prettier. There we go. That looks much better. Okay, so let's test this out a little bit more. I told you that it's going to store things like extra cheese, extra sauce, as well as size and crust to variables that we'd be able to access. Let's see how we're going to access those. Let's print out what exactly parsed args is. And to illustrate the difference between specifying a destination, we're going to comment out the destination for sauce. Let's save this. First, let's take a look at the help text, make sure everything looks good. Good. We still have our positional arguments, and now we have the extra cheese and extra sauce optional arguments. Now let's actually pass in some values for this. For our size, we'll go with large, and then the crust, we'll say thin. This time we're going to pass in -c as well as -s. Remember that we now have the shorter form of these as well. We could just have easily have said -- extra sauce. But for consistency, we'll stay with -s, so you don't think that that is affecting the variable that's returned. We'll run this, and we see what was printed out is a namespace object. And in this object, we see it has attributes size is equal to the string L, crust is equal to the string thin, cheese is set to true, and we see extra_sauce is equal to true. Perfect. Now, if we were to revert this change, so uncomment that, give ourselves a little bit more room and run it again, we now see instead of seeing extra sauce, we just see sauce. At this point, you might be thinking that we're missing one crucial thing for our entire pizza builder. And you're absolutely right. We do not have a way to specify toppings. So let's do that now. Parser.addArgument. This one is going to be, for consistency, -t, as well as --toppings. You don't always have to give it that shorthand. As a matter of fact, I'm going to strip the shorthand from extra cheese and extra sauce, because as a general rule, if something is a flag in my CLIs, I don't really like to have it as the short form. Some people do. That's entirely personal preference. But since toppings is not a flag, we're going to offer the -t option as well. So let's also give it good formatting right out the bat. The type of our toppings should be string. And now we're going to do something really cool with Argparse. We're going to say that n args, or the number of arguments, is equal to a plus in quotes. When we specify a plus for n args, we're telling Argparse that you should expect at least one argument for toppings when passed in. If you want to allow people to pass in 0 or more, you can put a star. Both of these will be collected into a list of arguments passed into toppings, which is going to be helpful for our processing later. Additionally, if you wanted them to pass in specifically 3 toppings, say this is a 3-topping pizza all the time, then you can pass in the number 3, or 5, or any other integer you can think of, like an 18-topping pizza. Finally, if you want them to be able to pass in multiple arguments, but only consume or only store one argument, you can add the question mark there. But we're going to keep it as a plus. So number args is equal to plus, or a list of 1 or more toppings. Finally, let's add some help text. There we go. We'll save it and see how this looks with the help text. Perfect. Welcome to Pizza Builder. We have our positional arguments. We have our optional arguments, including the free -- help. We also have toppings in there. Let's run this through with our previous example. And as expected, since we passed in -c and -s, which are no longer part of our extra cheese and extra sauce optional arguments, it gives us a nice warning here. It says error, unrecognized arguments, -c and -s. This is the kind of input validation that it's doing automatically for us. While we're testing bad cases, let's go ahead and not specify a value for crust, and we see the following arguments are required. Crust. We get rid of that L there. We see the following arguments are required, size and crust. Okay, let's put that back. Extra cheese. Okay, we see our namespace object. Of course, size is large, crust is thin, toppings is none, cheese is true, and sauce is false. Now let's try adding some toppings. Say -t, bacon, and let's try saying onion as well. We see we now have under toppings a list including bacon and onion. If we just specify bacon, it's still a list. So if we pass in nothing for toppings, we get none. Otherwise, if something is passed in, we're going to get a list. Perfect. We're now ready to plug this into our build pizza helper method. Okay, our build pizza is still going to accept an order. This time, instead of order being a dictionary, it's going to be a namespace object, meaning instead of saying order and then the key of size, we can just put order.size. Same thing for crust. .crust. Again, since it's a namespace object and we know that if toppings aren't specified, it's going to be none, we can just have order.toppings. So if order.toppings, we know that order.toppings would be a list because it is a truthy value, or it's a list with some entries in it. Otherwise, we're not going to add toppings to our pizza. Same thing with extra cheese. This time, instead of it being extra cheese, we can just say cheese, because remember that we are storing this with a different destination. The destination being cheese, which we also see down here in the namespace object. So if order.cheese, we're going to add in the extra cheese. Same thing with sauce. Beautiful. It even looks better this way as well. Now the last thing that we need to do is store the output of that as pizza, call build pizza, pass in our parsed arguments, and finally print out the same message that we did in the previous video. Your pizza is pizza. For now, let's keep this little print statement in here just so we can see how everything is running. Let's clear our output and see how our previous order would look. Okay, it says your pizza is large thin crust with bacon plus extra cheese. Awesome. Let's add back in the onions, and then we'll change it up from a thin to a normal pizza. And this one is going to be XXL. Here we go. Your pizza is extra large with bacon, onion, plus extra cheese. And we see that this matches up with the values that were stored in the namespace object. So now that we've verified that the namespace object works perfectly fine, we'll get rid of that print statement and see the final output here. Nice and clean. If we were to pass in some bad values here, so instead of having one of the accepted sizes, we'll pass in Q. We see that the argument size received an invalid choice. The choice that was invalid was Q, and it's telling the user to choose from small, medium, large, etc. As you would expect, the same thing is true with the crusts. So instead of saying a normal crust, we'll say a weird crust. Again, invalid choice weird, and here are the options that are actually available for us. We accomplished all of this in just 61 lines of code, whereas our previous version took 88 lines of code. And this is also with quite a bit of extra formatting that isn't technically needed and could likely reduce our lines of code by 10 or more. Well, that wraps up this video. Now that you understand how to use Argparse to write CLIs, try writing some of your own. What is your favorite trick with Argparse, or is it something I showed today? Leave a comment down below to let me know. As always, today's code will be added to the Understanding GitHub repo, so check the description for a link. And of course, if you have any questions or suggestions for topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment for me. To keep up with this series, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.